So let's say that you're just not really interested in making sourdough bread and you just want to get into baking bread with yeast, but you're not really sure where to start. You don't know which yeast to get. There's a couple you can choose from. You don't know how to store it. You don't know how to activate it. Well, today we're going to talk all about that, and we're going to talk about baking with conventional yeast versus sourdough bread and why I think it's one of the best tools in the kitchen. So let's jump right in. Conventional yeast is actually isolated yeast from sourdough starter. A sourdough starter has yeast and lactic acid, whereas conventional yeast is just the yeast. And so they're both yeast. They both work the same, do the same thing. They proof and rise dough. They just do it on a whole different level of time, and it just works different. But we're not going to get into that. We just want to talk about the conventional yeast did come from isolating those yeast. And what happens is when you buy yeast, you're getting like a dehydrated form of that yeast. And if you buy active dry yeast, you have to activate it. If you buy instant yeast, it's like pulverized and you don't have to. You can just throw it in your recipe. That's what I use because it's so easy. But let's talk about this. So you go to the store, there's active dry yeast, there's instant yeast. Which one do you get? It just really depends on a preference. They're going to do the same thing. Instant yeast is going to rise bread. Active dry yeast is going to rise bread. The only difference is, as I said before, active dry will need to be proofed and instant will not. So to activate active dry yeast, all you need to do is take the water from your recipe, heat it to around 105 degrees. I recommend using a thermometer until you learn what 105 degree water feels like on the back of your hand. After that, you won't need it anymore. And heat it to 105 degrees, no hotter than 110 degrees. Pour it in a bowl or a mixing cup and add your yeast. I like to add a little pinch of sugar. You don't have to, but I always have done that, and it activates kind of quick. Mix it up, cover it with either plastic wrap, a lid, a tea towel, something, and then about 5 to 10 minutes later, it's going to look frothy and active and happy, and that's how you know that your yeast is alive. If it doesn't do anything, then your yeast is dead, and it's dead. You just got to go buy some more. But it's always nice to know that your yeast is going to work before you put it in a recipe, because I have gotten a little careless and just thrown my yeast in, my active dry yeast, and it would be dead, and then my loaf just never did anything. The dough just sat there. So I highly recommend proofing your active dry yeast. Now, instant yeast, you don't have to proof it. You can just throw it into your recipe and you don't have to do anything special. Most recipes that call for instant yeast will have you add your water, your whether you're using butter or olive oil, and whether you're using honey and salt, and then some of the flour, and mix it up and then add the yeast. So if you're using active dry yeast and you proof it, then you just proceed with your bread recipe the way that it says to do it. But let's say that you want to use instant yeast and the recipe that you found calls for active dry yeast. All you have to do is just go ahead and add the yeast in as you're mixing everything up. Now, I prefer to add liquids and salt, a little bit of the flour, mix it up, and then add the yeast. And that just seems to work really well at dissolving that yeast and getting everything going. Now, it's super fast to make a loaf of bread with yeast, whether you use active dry or instant. It's super fast. You will have a loaf of bread inside of 2.5 to 3 hours, sometimes even sooner, depending on how warm or humid that your kitchen is. And that is very appealing when you are starting out in your bread making journey. And I highly recommend that you do yeast for a good while before you get into moving on to things like sourdough. So let's talk about how to store yeast. Let's say that you've went all in and you've bought your 1 pound packet of yeast. That's what I buy. It's in this big thing that's like vacuum sealed. I keep mine in the freezer and it lasts and lasts and lasts. I've never had it go bad. And I get just a little bit out. I put it in an airtight container in the fridge, And once I go through that, I refill it, and I just keep doing that. You can use it straight from the freezer though. I know a lot of people who do that. It works just fine. I've just always used mine from the fridge ever since I started baking. So it's just what you get used to doing. So let's say that you get into the bread baking and you find a recipe that is a sourdough recipe, and you say, but I want to make this yeast. I get this question all the time. You can flip-flop those recipes so easy, just knowing something super simple. If you have a recipe that calls for a half a cup of sourdough starter and you want to convert that to yeast, then you're going to want to use a packet of yeast, which is 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. And you're also going to want to increase your flour and your water by 1/4 cup. And that's it. That's how you take a sourdough recipe that calls for half a cup of starter and you convert it to a yeast recipe. You increase the flour by 1/4 cup, increase the water by 1/4 cup, and add 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. That will work perfect. And then in the future, if you find a recipe that's yeast and you want to make it sourdough, just flip-flop everything. Just for every 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast, add a half a cup of sourdough starter and decrease the flour and water by 1/4 cup. You can just, all recipes are open if you use that simple little method of changing them over. I don't even look at yeast or sourdough when I'm looking at a bread recipe. I look at, if it's a recipe I want to use, then I just do those tiny little changes and it works perfect. So that will help you as you're looking for recipes, because there are, it seems like trillions of sourdough bread recipes, but you can easily convert them to yeast, so don't worry. And you can make some beautiful loaves. So yeah, so there we go. We got what yeast is, what the 2 different types of yeast are, how to activate active dry yeast, how to store your yeast, and how to convert a sourdough recipe over to a yeast recipe. I hope that this was helpful for you if you are wanting to jump into bread baking, but you're not quite ready to jump on the sourdough boat yet. You want to do just something a little more predictable, a little bit easier to work with, and I highly recommend it. Like I said, I use yeast every week in my kitchen, and I think it's great, and I love sourdough as well. So I think your kitchen can be harmonious with both. All right, well, I hope that this was helpful for you if you had questions about yeast. If you have any questions that I didn't answer, please leave them down in the comments below, and I will try to get back to you just as soon as I can with the answer to that question. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you're brand new here, I make all kinds of videos about sourdough, bread baking, gardening, food preservation, and just cooking in general. Things that I just truly enjoy in my life. Homemaking, all those things. If that's interesting to you, I would appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. I make 2 new videos every week, and we sure would like to have you here. All right, we'll see you on the next video.